Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 6th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. King Herod heard of what Jesus was doing, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah, and others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he solemnly swore to her, whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She replied, the head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved, yet, out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in the tomb. The Gospel of the Lord. So sometimes, in order to keep track of the cast of characters in the Bible, you almost need a scorecard. And this is particularly true whenever we read about King Herod in the New Testament. And that's because there are actually 3 King Herods in the New Testament, and that's not counting some of the other people that were technically also named Herod but aren't called Herod in the New Testament. All of them were related to each other, and all of them were puppet kings. They were people set up by the Romans who had conquered the area years before. The King Herod that we probably most remember was Herod the Great. He was the father of most of the other Herods, and he was the king when Jesus was born. He was a particularly nasty guy. Matthew's Gospel accuses him of slaughtering children in and around Bethlehem right after Jesus was born in an attempt to kill Jesus. We don't have any record of that outside of the New Testament. However, the Jewish historian Josephus, writing at the beginning of the 2nd century, says that we do know that Herod slaughtered many of his own kids. He killed several of his sons and one of his wives when he thought they were plotting against him. And because he was that really horrible, ruthless kind of person, he kept really good order in his domain, so the Romans liked him a lot, and they allowed him to stay in power. He was kind of like the early version of Saddam Hussein. He was so terrifying that people behaved from things, and he was pretty ruthless. After his death, his kingdom, which at that point was most of what is today Israel and southern Lebanon, was divided up amongst his sons, the ones he didn't kill. The southern part, around Jerusalem, went to a guy named Archelaus. He was not as good at keeping order as his father was, and so eventually the Romans exiled him, and they made the whole area around Jerusalem a Roman kind of governorship, which is how Pontius Pilate comes to be in charge and to be the person who judges Jesus later on. But the northern area around Galilee went to Herod Antipas. He is the King Herod that we read about in today's Gospel reading. Frankly, the Romans didn't care that much about the northern area around Galilee, and Herod Antipas was brutal enough to keep things in line. So this King Herod becomes the King Herod we most frequently hear about in the New Testament because he was in Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his life. But this King Herod was also known for the intrigue that surrounded his life. Herod Antipas was, after all, a collaborator with the Romans, who was charged first and foremost with making sure that nobody challenged Roman rule. He was a collaborator. He was nobody's friend, so it wasn't like He was this nice king that you could go to and say, "Oh, king, I am being unjustly treated," and expect anything good out of him. He had a small army, and he could kill or terrorize anybody he wanted to, as long as he didn't mess with the Romans. So if somebody like John the Baptist got in his way, was a threat perhaps to his political power, he could throw him in prison or have him killed on a whim, as he does in today's gospel reading. And, as today's gospel reading makes clear, he also flaunted social and moral norms. Mark says that John the Baptist ended up in prison because he was telling Herod it was wrong for him to have married Herodias, his brother's wife. Now, if you notice that Herodias is a name that sounds kind of like Herod, it's because she too is part of the family. It is true that Herodias was married to one of Herod's brothers, actually not Philip, but one of his brothers, also probably named Herod. But the reason she's named Herodias is because she was a niece of Herod Antipas. So Herod was married to his niece, which is even grosser than what Mark tells us in the Gospel. The thing is, everybody in Galilee and the surrounding area knew all of these things about Herod. They knew it. It was part of their news feed every single day. All of the things that Herod did that caused social, political, moral outrage, that was the regular thing that people had to deal with each and every day. And there was little anybody could really do about it except to try to figure out the next outrageous thing that Herod was going to do and to try to stay out of the way. And so there's sort of this cathartic need in today's gospel reading to recount again some of the horrible and the outrageous things that Herod Antipas did. It takes up the entire gospel reading so that Jesus, remember Jesus? It's the gospel, it's a story about Jesus. Jesus almost seems lost as a footnote. He is mentioned only in passing as Herod is thinking, maybe this Jesus guy is the next religious leader who needs to lose his head. In fact, Jesus almost gets lost in the midst of the moral, political, and social outrage of today's gospel text. And indeed, it probably was the case that what Jesus said and what Jesus did went unnoticed to many people, even in Galilee, because they were so distracted by all of the crap that was going on, all of the social, political, moral outrage that filled their newsfeed every single day because of what Herod was doing. And yet, God was doing a new and powerful thing in Jesus, in spite of Herod Antipas. The words and deeds of Jesus proved more lasting and more meaningful than anything that Herod did. And I've had to tell you all about Herod because in the end, centuries later, nobody remembers Herod, but people remember Jesus. Often, when this gospel reading comes up in the lectionary, preachers wonder, what do we do with this thing? Because it seems like it's all about Herod and Jesus just gets lost in the noise. And yet, in every age, that's the challenge. There are, and always have been, and always will be, different moral, political, and social outrages that fill our news feeds and threaten to overwhelm our hearts and our minds. Sometimes, we get so caught up in them that it's hard to notice that there's anything else going on in the world around us. And if God is doing something new and lasting in our lives, it may go unnoticed or even seen as just kind of a passing footnote in the story of our daily lives. And so, maybe there's a reason for this text. Maybe there's a good reason for this gospel. As horrible as it is, this gospel text today reminds us that Jesus is actually always at work and always has been at work, even during times when the world seems consumed by political, social, and moral outrages. Jesus is never waiting for some better, more peaceful, more calm time when the world just seems more just, more safe, when somehow or other it seems like it's more ready for God. In fact, many of the stories that we read about Jesus happened at times that are, we read them and we're
when we sing Silent Night and all this kind of stuff around Christmas, that was some of the biggest turmoil the world had ever seen at that time. And yet God was doing a new and lasting thing, even in the midst of all the turmoil of the world. God is always acting, even at those times where we're distracted by other stuff. Today's gospel text reminds us that even in the midst of all kinds of social, political, moral outrages that are going on, the work that God does among us ultimately outlasts all of the evil and all the distractions that threaten to consume us. And the work that God does often looks like the work of Jesus. It's about healing and feeding, befriending those who have lost hope. Those things actually made a lasting impact on people. Those were the things people remembered long after they forgot about all the stuff that Herod was doing. And today's gospel reading reminds us that Jesus calls us today also, especially when the world around us seems to be consumed by intrigue and outrage, to watch for and to be part of what Jesus is doing in our lives and in the life of the world. And maybe that's never more important than when it seems like so much around us is falling apart. See, Herod noticed Jesus only in passing, but other people found in Jesus a real center to their lives. They centered themselves around him and around his message, and that gave them meaning and hope and power to move forward, in spite of the fact that there were always going to be guys like Herod trying to fill the news feeds. Now, please understand that this also does not mean stick your head in the sand and ignore all the messes. The messes are things that we are called to deal with. John the Baptist lost his head because of Herod Antipas, and we need to be eyes wide open to the dangers that our world faces. We need to be people who use the resources God gives us to address the messes of our world. We need to not stick our heads in the sand, and we have options and opportunities that the New Testament just does not envision. The New Testament's all the writers of the New Testament envisioned that when you faced any kind of big problem in the world, you had two options: lose your head or duck and cover. The idea that people could be citizens of a representative democracy and had options like voting the bums out or insisting on the rule of law or any of that kind of stuff, that wasn't even in their wheelhouse. But God calls us to engage in those kinds of things. But even as we engage in all of those problems that we really do need to engage in, it's important for us, just like people in Jesus' day, not to get so caught up that we miss what God is doing in our lives and what God is calling us to do. So in the midst of whatever messes you feel called in your life to engage in, and no matter what social, political, or moral outrage happens to be filling your newsfeed at this particular moment, don't let Jesus become a footnote in your life. Don't miss out on what Jesus is doing in the midst of the real messes that our world is caught up in. And don't get so caught up in the intrigue of the day that you don't have time and energy and bandwidth left in order to be part of what Jesus is doing in your life and in the life of the world.